The gunshots echoed through the morning air as Penelope Frost ducked behind a barrel, her heart pounding in her chest like a stampede of wild horses. What had started as a routine trip to deliver eggs to the general store in Idaho City, Idaho, had turned into a nightmare when Luther Kane and his gang of outlaws rode into town, their guns blazing and their eyes set on the bank and on her, when she'd had the misfortune to witness their faces. "Get that girl," Luther's gravelly voice commanded, and Penelope knew she had to run. It was the spring of 1872, and Idaho City was still recovering from the gold rush that had brought it to prominence. The once bustling mining town had settled into a quieter existence, though remnants of its wilder days still lingered in the form of saloons and the occasional band of outlaws passing through. Penelope, 22 years old and managing her late parents' small farm on the outskirts of town, had never expected to become the target of such men. She ran as fast as her boots would carry her, her long skirts hiked up in her hands, heading for the only shelter she could see: her family's old barn at the edge of her property. The wooden structure, weathered by years of Idaho seasons, loomed ahead as salvation. Behind her, she could hear the thundering of hooves as the bandits pursued. Penelope burst through the barn doors, slamming them shut behind her and hastily sliding the wooden bolt into place. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she scanned the dim interior, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. The barn was mostly empty except for some farming tools, a few bales of hay, and her father's old shotgun hanging on the wall, a gun she knew was unloaded, the ammunition locked away in the farmhouse she couldn't reach. "We know you're in there, Missy," came a rough voice from outside. "You saw our faces, and we can't have no witnesses. Come on out and maybe we'll be gentle with you." Cruel laughter followed the threat, and Penelope's blood ran cold. She was trapped, and they knew it. "I'll give you to the count of 10 before we start shooting," Luther Kane called out. Penelope scrambled up to the hayloft, hoping to find a way out or at least a better vantage point. The small window high up on the barn wall was too small for her to squeeze through. She was trapped. All she could do was pray that Sheriff Adams would return from his trip to Boise soon, or that someone in town would have the courage to come to her aid. 1, 2, the countdown began. Outside the barn, unbeknownst to Penelope or the bandits, a lone rider had just crested the hill overlooking the Frost farm. Wyatt Oakley, 26 years old and newly arrived from Montana Territory, had been on his way to Idaho City in search of work when he heard the commotion. He pulled his chestnut stallion to a halt, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. 5 men, all armed, surrounding a barn. The fresh graves on the small hill behind the farmhouse told him this was likely a family property with few defenders left. And from the way the men were shouting, there was someone trapped inside that barn who desperately needed help. Wyatt's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip. He'd come to Idaho to escape violence, not to find more of it, but he couldn't ride past and leave whoever was in that barn to the mercy of those men. 5. The counting continued as Wyatt dismounted, tethering his horse to a tree out of sight. He studied the situation carefully. 5 against 1 weren't odds he liked, especially in a direct confrontation. But he noticed the large oak tree that grew beside the barn, its branches stretching over the roof. A plan began to form in his mind. 8, 9. Inside the barn, Penelope had pressed herself against the wall of the hayloft, a pitchfork clutched in her trembling hands. It wasn't much of a weapon against guns, but she wasn't going down without a fight. 10. Time's up, girl. The first shot splintered through the barn door, followed by another and another. Penelope dropped to the floor of the loft, covering her head as bullets tore through the aged wood of the barn. Outside, Wyatt used the noise of the gunfire to mask his approach. Moving swiftly through the trees, he made his way to the oak. With the agility born from years of ranch work, he began to climb, his strong hands finding purchase in the rough bark. "Hold your fire," Luther ordered his men. "Save some bullets, she ain't going nowhere." In the sudden silence, Penelope could hear the men moving around the barn, positioning themselves at every possible exit. They were going to wait her out or smoke her out either way. Her situation was dire. Then she heard something else, a soft thud on the roof above her. At first, she thought it might be a branch blown by the wind, but then came another sound, deliberate and rhythmic. Footsteps. Wyatt moved as quietly as possible across the barn roof. Years of repairing roofs on his family's Montana ranch had taught him how to distribute his weight to avoid making noise. He located a section where the boards looked weaker, possibly rotted by years of rain and snow. "Boss, should we just burn the place down?" one of the bandits suggested, his voice carrying through the spring air. "Not yet," Luther replied. "That'll draw too much attention. We'll give her another hour to reconsider, then maybe we'll have ourselves a little bonfire." Penelope's heart sank at these words. She glanced up at the ceiling, startled to see the tip of a knife working its way between two boards. Was one of the bandits trying to get in from above? She raised her pitchfork, ready to strike. The boards creaked, and then a small section gave way, just enough for a face to appear. Not the hardened, cruel face of an outlaw, but a face with kind blue eyes and a concerned expression. A stranger's face, but one that instantly gave Penelope hope. "Don't scream," the man whispered, his voice low and calm. "I'm here to help. My name's Wyatt." "They'll kill us both," Penelope whispered back, lowering her pitchfork. "Not if we're smart," Wyatt replied. "Can you climb? I can get you out through the roof." Penelope nodded, relief washing over her like a cool rain after a drought. "Yes, I can climb." Wyatt worked quickly but quietly, using his knife to widen the gap in the boards. As he did so, he explained his plan in hushed tones. "There's a tree next to the barn. We can use it to get down and slip away while they're watching the doors." Finally, the hole was big enough for Penelope to squeeze through. Wyatt extended his hand and she took it, allowing him to help pull her up onto the roof. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a working man, and despite the dire circumstances, Penelope couldn't help but notice how securely it held hers. "Stay low," Wyatt instructed as they crouched on the sloped roof. "And follow me." Below them, the bandits continued their watch, unaware that their quarry was escaping right above their heads. Wyatt led Penelope to the edge of the roof nearest the oak tree. Its thick branches reached out like welcoming arms. "I'll go first," he whispered, "then help you across." With the nimble movements of someone used to such tasks, Wyatt crossed from the roof to the tree, navigating the gap with ease. Once secure on a sturdy branch, he turned and reached out for Penelope. She hesitated for just a moment, fear of the height nearly paralyzing her, but the sound of the bandits' voices below spurred her on. Taking a deep breath, she reached for Wyatt's outstretched hand. Their fingers met, clasped, and he pulled her across the gap. For a heart-stopping moment, her foot slipped, and a small gasp escaped her lips. Wyatt's grip tightened, and with surprising strength, he pulled her safely onto the branch beside him. "I've got you," he assured her, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her fear. Their faces were close, and for a brief instant their eyes locked, blue meeting green before the urgency of their situation reasserted itself. "What was that?" one of the bandits called out, having heard something. "Check around back," Luther ordered. "We need to move," Wyatt whispered urgently. Down the tree, then into the forest. My horse is tethered just beyond that ridge." They descended the oak with as much speed as they dared, the rough bark scratching at Penelope's palms. When they reached the lowest branch, Wyatt dropped down first, then held up his arms to catch her. She slid into his grasp, his strong hands circling her waist and lowering her safely to the ground. "There they are," came a shout from around the corner of the barn. "Run," Wyatt urged, grabbing Penelope's hand. They sprinted for the tree line as bullets kicked up dirt at their heels. Penelope's heart hammered in her chest, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. Wyatt's hand remained firmly clasped around hers, guiding her through the trees. They reached his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that snorted nervously at their abrupt arrival. Wyatt untethered him quickly, then turned to Penelope. "Can you ride?" he asked, already moving to help her up. "Yes," she nodded, gathering her skirts as he boosted her onto the horse's back. Wyatt swung up behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. The warmth of his chest against her back was oddly comforting in the midst of their peril. "Hold on tight," he instructed, and then they were off, the horse surging forward through the forest. Behind them, they could hear the bandits shouting and the sounds of horses being mounted. The chase had begun. Wyatt guided his stallion expertly through the trees, taking paths too narrow for the bandits to follow abreast, forcing them to slow down and ride single file. Every time they gained a bit of distance, he changed direction, attempting to confuse their pursuers. "Where are we going?" Penelope asked, her voice jolting with each stride of the horse. "There's an old mining camp north of here," Wyatt replied, his breath warm against her ear. "It's abandoned now, but we can hide out there until it's safe to head for town or the next settlement." They rode hard for what felt like hours, the spring sun climbing high in the sky. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded, but Wyatt didn't slow their pace. Better to be certain they'd lost the bandits entirely. By mid-afternoon, they reached the abandoned mining camp Wyatt had mentioned. It was nestled in a small valley, a collection of dilapidated wooden structures that had once housed hopeful miners during the gold rush. Nature had begun to reclaim the site, with wildflowers pushing up through the weathered boardwalks and vines creeping up the walls of the buildings. Wyatt brought the horse to a halt near what appeared to have been the main office, a two-story structure that had weathered the elements better than its neighbors. He dismounted first, then helped Penelope down, his hands steady on her waist. "Thank you," she said as her feet touched the ground, finally having a moment to truly acknowledge what he'd done for her. "You saved my life back there." Wyatt's expression softened, the tension of their escape easing slightly. "I couldn't just ride past and leave you to those men. No decent person would." "There aren't many decent people left in these parts," Penelope replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "Not since the gold started running out." Wyatt led his horse to a lean-to attached to the main building, securing him there with access to what remained of a water trough. "I'm sorry to hear that. I just arrived in Idaho territory. Was hoping to find work in Idaho City." "What kind of work?" Penelope asked, following him into the shelter of the main building. The interior was dusty but intact, with a few pieces of abandoned furniture still scattered about. "Ranch work, mostly. I've been a cowhand since I was 15. Left Montana after the ranch I was working sold off." Wyatt checked the windows, making sure they had a clear view of any approach. "But I can turn my hand to most anything that needs doing." Penelope brushed dust from an old chair and sat down, the events of the day catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. "I have a farm. It was my parents', but they both passed last winter. Influenza." She spoke matter-of-factly, though the pain of the loss was still fresh. "I've been running it alone since then." Wyatt's expression softened with sympathy. That's a hard burden for anyone, let alone a young woman on her own. I manage, Penelope said with a hint of pride, then sighed. Or I did until today. I don't even know why those men targeted me. I was just in town delivering eggs when they rode in. They robbed the bank and somehow I ended up in their path. Their leader, I heard someone call him Luther, said I'd seen their faces and couldn't be left alive. Wyatt's brow furrowed. Luther Kane, Penelope nodded. You know of him? Every lawman from Canada to Mexico knows of Luther Kane. He and his gang have been terrorizing territories for years. Wyatt moved to sit across from her. If they're in Idaho City, no one there is safe. A chill ran through Penelope at his words. The sheriff is away in Boise. He won't be back for days. Then we need to be careful, Wyatt said, his blue eyes serious. Kane won't give up easily. He's known for being thorough and vengeful. As the reality of her situation settled over her, Penelope felt a wave of despair. I can't go back to my farm, can I? Not while they're looking for me. Wyatt hesitated, clearly not wanting to dash her hopes entirely. Not right away, no, but we can send word to the territorial marshal. Kane's gang is wanted in several territories. They'll send men. And in the meantime, Penelope asked, her green eyes meeting his. In the meantime, Wyatt said with determination, I'll keep you safe. As the afternoon waned, they took stock of their situation. Wyatt had some jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags, enough for a sparse meal. The abandoned camp had a well that still contained water, though they had to clear away debris to access it. They found an old pot to boil the water, making it safer to drink, and Wyatt managed to start a small fire using the driest wood he could find, keeping it small so the smoke wouldn't give away their position. As night fell, the temperature dropped. Idaho springs were notoriously unpredictable, warm days giving way to cold nights, especially in the higher elevations. Penelope shivered in her light dress, which was designed for working on a warm spring day, not for an overnight stay in an abandoned mining camp. Here, Wyatt said, shrugging out of his worn leather jacket and draping it over her shoulders. This should help. But you'll be cold, Penelope protested, even as she pulled the jacket tighter around herself, grateful for its warmth and the lingering scent of leather, horses, and something uniquely Wyatt. I'm used to it, he assured her with a small smile. Montana winters toughen a man up. They sat close to the small fire, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls of the old mining office. Through the broken windows, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, countless points of light in the vast blackness. Have you always lived in Idaho? Wyatt asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Penelope nodded. Born and raised. My parents came here during the gold rush in '62 like so many others. My father tried mining at first, but he wasn't cut out for it. He was a farmer back in Pennsylvania, so he claimed some land and went back to what he knew. Wise man, Wyatt commented. Gold can make a man lose his senses. I've seen it happen. What about you? Penelope asked. You said you're from Montana. Wyatt poked at the fire with a stick, sending a small shower of sparks upward. Born in Missouri, but we moved west when I was 10. My father heard there was good ranching land in Montana Territory. He was right, but he didn't live long enough to see the ranch thrive. Broke his neck when his horse stepped in a gopher hole. I was 15. I'm sorry, Penelope said softly, understanding the pain of losing parents all too well. Wyatt shrugged, but his expression betrayed the old hurt. My mother tried to keep the ranch going, but it was too much. We sold it to a cattle company from back east. She went to live with her sister in Oregon, and I started working other ranches. Been on my own ever since. Something in the way he said it made Penelope think there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their pains they didn't share with strangers, except they didn't quite feel like strangers anymore. Something about facing death together, about the trust required to place your life in another person's hands, had created a bond between them that defied the short time they'd known each other. "You think they'll find us here?" Penelope asked after another period of silence, voicing the fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind. Wyatt considered her question seriously. "It's possible, but not likely. This place is well off the main trails and we covered our tracks well. Kane and his men will probably focus on searching the areas closer to town first. And tomorrow we'll head further north, maybe to Centerville or Placerville, find a marshal or sheriff who can help us." Wyatt's voice was steady, reassuring. "Kane's gang is wanted for bank robberies across 3 territories. Once word gets out that they're in the area, every lawman within 100 miles will be after them." Penelope nodded, taking comfort in his confidence. "I just hope no one else gets hurt because of me." "This isn't because of you," Wyatt said firmly. "Kane and his men made their choices. You're just trying to survive." Their eyes met across the fire and something passed between them: understanding, connection, the recognition of kindred spirits. Penelope felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her chest. "We should try to get some sleep," Wyatt suggested, breaking the moment. "I'll take first watch. You get some rest." Penelope wanted to protest, to insist that she could take a watch too, but exhaustion was pulling at her, the day's events catching up all at once. Instead, she simply nodded and moved to where Wyatt had arranged some old sacks to create a makeshift bed. "Wake me in a few hours," she said, settling down with his jacket still wrapped around her. "You need rest too." Wyatt nodded, though they both suspected he might let her sleep through the night. As Penelope closed her eyes, the last thing she saw was Wyatt's silhouette against the stars, a steady presence keeping watch over her. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully to Penelope. Each creak of the old building, each whisper of wind through the broken windows, startled her awake, her mind conjuring images of Luther Kane and his men finding their hideout. During one such moment of wakefulness, she found Wyatt sitting beside her, his hand gently stroking her hair. "SHH," he whispered when he saw her eyes open. "Just a branch against the window. You're safe." The simple touch and reassurance were so unexpectedly comforting that tears sprang to Penelope's eyes. How long had it been since someone had cared for her this way? Since her parents' deaths, she'd been utterly alone, facing each day's challenges by herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Wyatt's eyes, visible in the dim light of the dying fire, were gentle. "Get some rest, Penelope. I'm not going anywhere." And somehow, despite everything, she believed him. With that reassurance, she finally drifted into a deeper sleep. Morning came with the soft chirping of birds and the golden light of dawn filtering through the broken windows. Penelope awoke to find Wyatt's jacket still draped over her, and the man himself dozing in a sitting position against the wall, his hat tipped low over his eyes. She took a moment to truly look at him in the clear light of day. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and a square jaw shadowed with a day's worth of beard. His clothes were worn but well kept, speaking of a man who took pride in himself despite limited means. As if sensing her gaze, Wyatt stirred, pushing his hat back and blinking away sleep. Their eyes met, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Sleep well, better than I expected to," Penelope admitted, sitting up and smoothing her hair. She was acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after sleeping in her clothes. Did you get any rest at all? Wyatt stretched, his broad shoulders rolling beneath his cotton shirt. Enough. I've gone on less during roundups. They shared a simple breakfast of jerky and water, planning their next move as they ate. Wyatt had a rough map of the territory in his saddlebags and they studied it together, heads bent close. Placerville is closest, Wyatt pointed out, tracing a path with his finger. But it's small. Might not have a lawman with enough men to take on Kane's gang. Idaho City would be better, Penelope said. Sheriff Adams is expected back from Boise soon and he has deputies. But, she trailed off, the danger evident. But that's where Kane is likely looking for you, Wyatt finished her thought. And we don't know if they're still in town or if they've moved on after the robbery. They debated their options, finally deciding to head toward Centerville. It was larger than Placerville, but not as obvious a destination as Idaho City. They could find help there and send word to the territorial marshal about Kane's presence in the area. As they prepared to leave, gathering their meager belongings and readying Wyatt's horse, a sound froze them both in place, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. "Get inside," Wyatt urged, helping Penelope back into the mining office. "Stay low and out of sight." He quickly dispersed the remains of their fire, scattering the ashes, then led his horse into the lean-to, speaking softly to keep the animal quiet. Returning to the office, he drew his revolver and positioned himself at a window, carefully peering out. "How many?" Penelope whispered from where she crouched behind an old desk. "Can't tell yet," Wyatt replied, his expression tense. "Could be Kane's men, could be miners or travelers." The hoofbeats grew louder, and then voices could be heard, rough, male voices that made Penelope's blood run cold. "Spread out and check all the buildings," came a commanding voice that she recognized instantly. Luther Kane. They had to have gone somewhere, and this old camp is the only shelter for miles. Wyatt ducked below the window, moving silently to Penelope's side. "It's Kane and at least 4 others," he whispered, his face grim. "They must have followed our trail after all." Penelope's heart raced with fear. "What do we do?" Wyatt's mind worked quickly, assessing their limited options. "There's a back door. If we can make it to the trees behind the camp, we might be able to circle around while they're searching the buildings." "And your horse?" A flash of regret crossed Wyatt's face. "We might have to leave him. 2 people on horseback are too easy to spot." The thought clearly pained him, but survival had to come first. Penelope nodded her understanding, preparing herself for what was to come. They moved silently toward the back of the building, keeping low. The rear door was partially blocked by debris, and Wyatt carefully cleared just enough for them to squeeze through. Outside, a steep, wooded hill rose behind the camp, offering cover if they could reach it undetected. "Ready," Wyatt whispered, his hand on the door. Penelope nodded, her throat too dry for words. Wyatt took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining, and the simple connection gave her strength. Slowly, carefully, Wyatt eased the door open. It creaked slightly, and they both froze, listening for any indication that the sound had been noticed. When no shouts came, they slipped outside, immediately crouching low in the shadow of the building. The woods were tantalizingly close, perhaps 50 yards away across open ground. They would be exposed for only a brief time, but in that moment, they would be vulnerable. "Wait for my signal," Wyatt instructed, his eyes scanning the area. "When I squeeze your hand, we run. Don't stop for anything until we reach the trees." Penelope's heart thundered in her chest as they waited, watching, listening. The voices of Kane's men echoed around the camp as they searched building after building, growing closer to their hiding place. "Now," Wyatt whispered urgently, squeezing her hand. They bolted from the shadow of the building, running as fast as they could toward the tree line. Penelope's lungs burned and her legs protested, but fear drove her forward. Wyatt kept pace beside her, never letting go of her hand. They had nearly reached the trees when a shout went up behind them. There they are. The crack of a gunshot split the air, and dirt kicked up just feet away from them. Wyatt pulled Penelope harder, and they crashed into the undergrowth, the branches and leaves providing immediate cover as they continued to run. "Keep moving," Wyatt urged as they navigated the steep, wooded hillside. "They'll have to go around to get their horses." Behind them, they could hear the confused shouts of the bandits as they tried to organize a pursuit. The dense forest worked to Wyatt and Penelope's advantage, slowing their pursuers and making it difficult to track them. They ran until Penelope's legs threatened to give out, stumbling over roots and rocks, pushing through brush that scratched at their skin and tore at their clothes. Finally, they reached a small stream cutting through the forest, and Wyatt pulled them to a halt. "In the water," he instructed between labored breaths. "It'll hide our scent and our tracks." They waded into the cold stream, the shock of it momentarily stealing Penelope's breath. The water was only ankle-deep but swift, flowing over smooth stones. They moved upstream against the current, making their path harder to follow. After several hundred yards, Wyatt led them out of the stream and onto a rocky outcropping that would leave minimal tracks. Only then did they pause to catch their breath, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. "I think we've lost them for now," Wyatt said after a moment, though his expression remained vigilant. "But they won't give up easily. Cain's not known for that." Penelope leaned against a tree, her legs trembling from exertion. "What now? We've lost your horse, our supplies." "We keep moving," Wyatt replied simply. "Centerville is north of here. If we can reach it by nightfall, we'll find help." "Can we make it that far on foot?" Penelope asked, looking down at her practical but not exactly hiking-appropriate boots. Wyatt's expression softened as he regarded her, taking in her determination despite her obvious exhaustion. "We'll have to try, unless you'd rather wait here while I go for help." Penelope immediately shook her head. "No, we stay together." A smile touched Wyatt's lips, approval and something warmer lighting his blue eyes. "Together it is, then." They continued their journey, moving as quickly as they dared while still taking care to hide their trail. The day grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and they were grateful for the shade provided by the dense forest. When they found another stream, they stopped to drink and rest briefly. "May I ask you something?" Penelope said as they sat on the bank, their feet dangling in the cool water. Wyatt nodded, his attention partly on their surroundings but still focused on her. "Of course. Why did you help me? You could have ridden past, pretended you didn't see anything. It wasn't your fight." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "My father taught me that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one is watching, by the choices he makes when it would be easier to walk away." He met her eyes directly. "I couldn't ride past and leave you to those men, not and still call myself a man." The simplicity and sincerity of his answer touched something deep within Penelope. In a world that had often seemed harsh and unforgiving, especially since losing her parents, Wyatt's basic decency was like finding water in a desert. "Well," she said softly, "I'm grateful you feel that way. Not many would have risked their lives for a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," Wyatt replied, his gaze holding hers. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. After a moment, Wyatt cleared his throat and stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should keep moving. Still have a ways to go before Centerville." They continued their journey, the terrain growing more challenging as they moved higher into the foothills. By mid-afternoon, hunger was becoming a pressing concern. They hadn't eaten since their meager breakfast, and the physical exertion had depleted their energy. I don't suppose you know which plants are edible around here, Wyatt asked, scanning the forest floor. Penelope brightened slightly. Actually, I do. My mother was something of an expert on wild foods. She taught me what to look for. With renewed purpose, she began to search the area, eventually finding a patch of wild onions and some early spring greens. It wasn't much, but it would provide some sustenance. Wyatt, meanwhile, fashioned a rough fishing line from some items in his pockets, a small hook he carried for emergency repairs to his tack, and some strong thread from his handkerchief. His improvised fishing yielded a small trout, which they cooked over a tiny, smokeless fire. The meal was simple but revitalizing, and they both felt stronger as they continued their journey. As the day waned, however, Penelope began to struggle. Her boots, designed for farm work rather than long hikes through rough terrain, had rubbed blisters on her heels and toes. She tried to hide her discomfort, but Wyatt noticed her increasingly labored steps. "Let me see," he said, guiding her to a fallen log to sit. Reluctantly, Penelope removed her boot, wincing as it pulled away from the raw skin beneath. Wyatt's expression tightened at the sight of the angry blisters. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, his voice gentle rather than accusing. Penelope shrugged, embarrassed. "We need to keep moving. I didn't want to slow us down." Wyatt shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and admiration in his eyes. "You're remarkable, you know that. But pushing yourself to injury won't help either of us." From his shirt pocket, he produced a clean handkerchief, which he tore into strips. With gentle hands, he wrapped the makeshift bandages around the worst of her blisters, his touch careful and considerate. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it should help a bit." As he worked, Penelope found herself studying his face, the concentration in his blue eyes, the firm set of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows. This was a man who took care in all he did, who treated even small tasks with respect and attention. "There," he said finally, helping her ease her boot back on. "Better." Penelope tested her weight on the foot, finding the pain significantly reduced. "Much, thank you." Wyatt offered a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard edges carved by years of outdoor work and worry. "We'll find somewhere to rest soon. You've been brave enough for one day." The simple praise warmed Penelope more than it should have. She wasn't used to having her strength acknowledged as a woman alone in the West. She was expected to be either tough as nails or in need of constant protection, with little room for the complex reality in between. They continued on as the day began to fade, the forest growing darker around them. Wyatt estimated they were still several hours from Centerville, too far to reach before night fell completely. They would need to find shelter and continue in the morning. Fortune favored them when they discovered a small, abandoned trapper's cabin tucked into a hillside. The structure was sound, if dusty and somewhat musty-smelling, with a stone fireplace and a crude bed frame. "It's not the Grand Hotel," Wyatt remarked as they entered, "but it'll keep us warm and dry for the night." He set about gathering wood for a fire while Penelope cleared the worst of the dust from the interior. The domestic task felt strange after the intense fear and exertion of the day, yet there was something comforting in its normalcy. As darkness fell, they sat before a small fire, the flames casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. They'd found some forgotten supplies in a cupboard, tea leaves that were old but still usable, and a can of beans that Wyatt opened with his knife. It wasn't a feast, but with the wild onions and greens Penelope had gathered, it made for a satisfying meal. "You think they're still looking for us?" Penelope asked as they finished eating, the question that had been lurking in her mind all day finally finding voice. Wyatt considered before answering, his expression serious. "Yes, I think they are. Cain's not the type to let a witness go, especially one who can identify him to the law, and now he's looking for both of us." Penelope's heart sank at his honesty, though she appreciated that he didn't try to shield her from the truth. "I'm sorry I've drawn you into this. It wasn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I decided to help you," Wyatt replied firmly, "and I don't regret it." Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. In just a day, they'd faced death together, trusted each other with their lives, shared vulnerabilities that most people kept hidden. Such experiences forged connections that defied conventional timelines of acquaintance. "Tell me about your farm," Wyatt said after a moment, changing the subject to lighter ground. "What do you grow?" Grateful for the diversion, Penelope described the modest farm her parents had built: the vegetable fields and small orchard, the chickens and 2 milk cows, the single plow horse named Samson who was gentle as a lamb despite his size. "It's not much compared to some," she admitted, "but it's enough to support me with a little extra to sell in town. Or it was before." She trailed off, the reality of her situation settling over her again. Even if they reached safety, would she ever be able to return to her farm? Would Cain and his men be caught? Wyatt seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "One step at a time. First, we get to Centerville and alert the law, then we make sure you're safe." "And after that?" Penelope asked, the question encompassing more than just their immediate plans. Wyatt held her gaze, something warm and intent in his blue eyes. "After that? Well, I reckon that depends on what you want." The implication hung in the air between them, full of possibility. Penelope felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear for once. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What do you want?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, the firelight playing across his features. "A week ago, I would have said I wanted work, a decent wage, maybe my own small spread someday." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Now I'm not so sure that's all I want." The honesty of his answer, the vulnerability in it, touched Penelope deeply. She'd met plenty of men since her parents died, some who saw her as nothing but a woman alone, easy prey. Others who looked at her farm with calculating eyes, seeing a convenient way to acquire land without having to work for it. Wyatt was different. He saw her. "We should get some rest," he said after a moment, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Tomorrow will be another long day." The cabin had only the one bed frame, and Wyatt immediately offered it to Penelope, saying he would sleep by the fire. She protested, suggesting they share the frame was wide enough, and after all they'd been through, such proprieties seemed less important than practicality. Wyatt hesitated, his sense of propriety warring with common sense. "Are you sure? I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "I'm sure," Penelope replied simply. "We both need rest, and it's cold." They settled on the bed frame, a respectable distance between them, both still fully clothed except for their boots. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, exhaustion soon pulled Penelope toward sleep. The last thing she was aware of was the steady sound of Wyatt's breathing beside her, a reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone. Sometime in the night, the temperature dropped further, and Penelope found herself moving closer to Wyatt's warmth, half asleep and guided by instinct. His arm came around her, drawing her against his side, and she nestled into the shelter of his body, feeling safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. Morning came with the chirping of birds and the soft, golden light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. Penelope awoke to find herself still nestled against Wyatt's side, his arm around her waist, their bodies fitting together as if designed for each other. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. In the quiet of the morning, with danger temporarily at bay, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been feeling since he first appeared in the roof of her barn, an attraction that went beyond gratitude, a connection that defied their brief acquaintance. Wyatt stirred, his arm tightening slightly around her before he fully woke. When he realized their position, he started to withdraw, perhaps worried he'd overstepped. "It's all right," Penelope said softly, stopping him with a hand on his chest. "I don't mind." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first moment on the barn roof. Wyatt's gaze dropped to her lips, and Penelope felt her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then growing in confidence as Penelope responded, her hand moving to cup his jaw. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Wyatt's eyes searched hers. "I know this is fast," he began, his voice husky. "Nothing about the past 2 days has been normal," Penelope replied with a small smile. "I think we're beyond the usual rules of courtship." Wyatt chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her hand. "True enough. Still, I want you to know this isn't just because of our situation. What I feel for you, it's real." The simple, honest declaration warmed Penelope to her core. "I feel it too," she admitted. "Whatever this is between us, it's not just circumstance." They might have stayed in that moment longer, exploring this new dimension of their relationship. But reality intruded in the form of their empty stomachs, and the knowledge that Cain's men could still be searching for them. With reluctance, they rose and prepared for the day ahead. The journey to Centerville would take most of the day, but with renewed energy and spirits lifted by their shared feelings, they set out with determination. The forest was alive with morning activity, birds calling, small animals scurrying through the undergrowth, the occasional rustle of a larger creature moving away from their approach. They moved at a steady pace, Penelope's feet less painful thanks to Wyatt's improvised bandages and a better night's rest. As they walked, they talked more openly, sharing stories from their lives, learning about each other in the way of new lovers discovering the shapes of each other's histories. Wyatt told Penelope about growing up on the Montana ranch, about his dreams of having his own land someday. Penelope shared memories of her parents, of the farm in its better days, of her own hopes for the future. By midday, the forest began to thin, and they caught glimpses of the valley below where Centerville lay. The sight brought both relief and caution. They were close to help, but also more exposed. "We should be careful as we approach," Wyatt advised. "Cain might have men watching the roads into town." They decided to continue through the forest until they were directly above the town, then descend from the hillside rather than approach by the main road. It would be a more difficult route but safer. As they made their way along the ridge that overlooked Centerville, a sound stopped them both in their tracks, the distant but distinctive pounding of hooves, multiple riders moving fast. "Get down," Wyatt urged, pulling Penelope into the cover of some bushes. From their hiding place, they watched as 5 riders emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the valley, heading directly for Centerville. Even at this distance, the lead rider's distinctive red bandana identified him as Luther Cain. "They're heading for town," Penelope whispered, fear gripping her heart. "What if they hurt people looking for us?" Wyatt's expression was grim. "We need to get there first," warned the sheriff. They abandoned caution for speed, making their way down the hillside as quickly as they dared. The descent was treacherous in places, with loose rocks and steep drops that required careful navigation. By the time they reached the valley floor, Wyatt estimated that Cain and his men were already in Centerville. "We'll have to be careful," he said as they approached the edge of town. "Stay close to me." Centerville had once been a booming mining town but had settled into a quieter existence as the gold played out. Still, it was larger than many settlements in the area, with a proper main street lined with businesses, a church, and most importantly, a sheriff's office. Wyatt and Penelope kept to the back alleys, moving from shadow to shadow as they made their way toward the center of town. The normal bustle of daytime activity seemed subdued, and an unusual tension hung in the air. "Something's not right," Wyatt murmured as they paused behind the general store. "It's too quiet." They continued cautiously until they had a view of the main street. What they saw confirmed Wyatt's suspicions. Kane and his men had taken over the town. Two bandits stood guard outside the sheriff's office, while others positioned themselves at key points along the street. Townsfolk moved quickly, heads down, clearly intimidated by the armed strangers. "They've got control of the town," Wyatt said, his voice low. "Must have overpowered the sheriff." "What do we do now?" Penelope asked, the hope that had sustained her through their journey faltering. Wyatt's mind raced, considering their limited options. They couldn't face Kane's gang directly, the odds were too great. They needed help, but with the local law enforcement neutralized, where could they turn? The telegraph office, Wyatt realized suddenly. "If we can get to it, we can send word to the territorial marshal and boys. They'd send men right away for Kane." It was a sound plan, but the telegraph office was on the main street, currently under the watchful eyes of Kane's men. Getting there undetected would be nearly impossible. "We need a distraction," Penelope suggested, her mind working quickly despite her fear. "Something to draw their attention away from the telegraph office." Before Wyatt could respond, a commotion erupted at the far end of the street. A wagon had overturned, spilling its load of timber across the road. People were gathering, shouting, and the noise drew the attention of several of Kane's men who moved to investigate. "This might be our chance," Wyatt said, eyeing the now less guarded telegraph office. They waited for a moment when no one was looking their way, then darted across an alley toward the back of the telegraph office. The door was locked, but Wyatt made quick work of it with a technique he'd learned in his more adventurous youth. Inside, they found the telegraph operator, a young man named Edwin, tied to his chair with a gag in his mouth. Wyatt quickly freed him while Penelope kept watch at the window. "Kane and his men came in about an hour ago," Edwin explained in a rushed whisper once the gag was removed. "They've got the sheriff and his deputy locked up. Said they're looking for a woman and a cowboy who witnessed their bank robbery in Idaho City." "That would be us," Wyatt confirmed grimly. "We need to get a message to boys, to the territorial marshal." Edwin nodded, moving to his telegraph key. "I can do that. Kane doesn't know Morse code. He made me send a false message earlier saying all was well in Centerville, but I managed to add a brief warning at the end. Boys might already be suspicious." While Edwin composed and sent the message, Penelope kept watch. Kane's men were still distracted by the overturned wagon, but it wouldn't last forever. "Message sent," Edwin announced after a tense few minutes. "Boys confirms receipt and says a marshal and deputies are already on their way to investigate my earlier warning. They should be here by nightfall." Relief flooded through Penelope, but it was short-lived. Outside, the commotion with the wagon had been resolved and Kane's men were returning to their posts. "We need to hide," Wyatt said urgently. "Is there somewhere safe until the marshal arrives?" Edwin thought quickly. "The church. Father Thomas has a hidden cellar where he keeps the communion wine. Few people know about it." It was their best option. Edwin provided directions to the church and the secret entrance to the cellar, then resumed his position as if still tied up. If Kane's men checked on him, they wouldn't know he'd helped the fugitives. Wyatt and Penelope slipped out the back door of the telegraph office. keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the white steepled church at the edge of town. They reached it without incident and found Father Thomas inside, a kindly older man who didn't hesitate to offer them sanctuary when they explained their situation. "The Lord helps those in peril," he said simply, leading them to the hidden cellar entrance concealed beneath the altar. "You'll be safe here until help arrives." The cellar was small but clean, with a few casks of wine, some preserved food, and a couple of cots that Father Thomas explained were for travelers in need. He brought them water and promised to return with news when the marshal arrived. Left alone in the dim cellar, lit only by a single lantern, Wyatt and Penelope finally had a moment to breathe, to process everything that had happened. "You think the marshal will really come?" Penelope asked, sitting beside Wyatt on one of the cots. "Yes," Wyatt replied with confidence. "Cain is too notorious, too dangerous. They won't ignore the call." Penelope nodded, drawing comfort from his certainty. "And then what?" Wyatt turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "And then you'll be safe. You can return to your farm, rebuild your life." There was something in his tone that made Penelope's heart constrict. "And you? Where will you go?" Wyatt's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, his eyes intent on the motion. "That depends," he said finally, looking up to meet her gaze. "On you." Penelope's breath caught at the intensity in his blue eyes. "On me. I came to Idaho looking for work, for a place to belong," Wyatt said, his voice soft but steady. "I think I may have found something more important." The implications of his words hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. In the span of just 2 days, they had saved each other's lives, shared fears and dreams, formed a connection that defied the brevity of their acquaintance. "Wyatt," Penelope began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this is fast, perhaps foolishly so, but her words were cut off by a sudden commotion above, the sound of the church door banging open and heavy footsteps on the floor. "Where are they, Father?" came Luther Kane's harsh voice, echoing through the wooden floorboards. "We know they're in town. Someone's been helping them." Father Thomas's reply was calm, dignified. "This is a house of God, sir. I help all who come seeking sanctuary." "Don't play games with me, old man," Kane growled. "We've searched every building in this town except this church. They're here, and you're going to tell me where." Wyatt's hand moved to his revolver, his expression hardening as he listened to the confrontation above. Penelope touched his arm, silently pleading with him not to do anything rash. They were outnumbered, and revealing themselves now would only put Father Thomas in greater danger. "I have nothing to tell you," the priest replied firmly. "Now I must ask you to leave. You are desecrating this sacred space with your threats and weapons." There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of a blow and Father Thomas's cry of pain. Wyatt's grip tightened on his revolver, his jaw clenched in anger. "Search the place," Kane ordered his men. "Tear it apart if you have to." Heavy footsteps moved throughout the church, accompanied by the sounds of furniture being overturned, doors being thrown open. Wyatt and Penelope held their breath, praying that the hidden entrance to the cellar would remain undiscovered. Above them, the search continued, growing closer to the altar that concealed their hiding place. Wyatt positioned himself between Penelope and the cellar entrance, his revolver ready. If they were found, he would at least ensure she had a chance to escape. Just when it seemed discovery was inevitable, a new sound interrupted the search, a gunshot from outside the church, followed by shouting. "Boss," called one of Kane's men. "Riders coming, lots of them." The search immediately halted. "How many?" Kane demanded. "At least a dozen, maybe more." "Look like lawmen." The territorial marshal had arrived sooner than expected. Relief flooded through Penelope, though it was tempered by concern for Father Thomas and the townspeople who might be caught in any crossfire. "Get outside," Kane ordered his men. "Take positions. We're not going down without a fight." The bandits rushed from the church, leaving Father Thomas behind. As soon as they were gone, the priest hurried to the cellar entrance, opening it to reveal Wyatt and Penelope below. "The marshal has come," he said, his lip bleeding from Kane's blow but his eyes bright with hope. "But there will be violence. You should stay hidden until it's over." Wyatt shook his head, already climbing up from the cellar. "I can help. I'm good with a gun, and the marshal's men won't know the layout of the town like I do." Penelope followed him up, determined not to be left behind. "I'm coming too. I know Kane. I can identify him for the marshal." Father Thomas looked as if he wanted to argue but nodded instead. "God be with you both. I will pray for your safety." Outside the church, chaos had erupted. The marshal and his deputies had surrounded the town, but Kane and his men had taken defensive positions, using buildings and water troughs for cover. Gunfire echoed through the streets, and townspeople who hadn't been able to flee cowered in doorways and behind barrels. Wyatt assessed the situation quickly, noting the positions of the lawmen and the bandits. "We need to get to the marshal. Let him know who we are so his men don't mistake us for Kane's gang." They moved carefully around the periphery of the conflict, staying low and using whatever cover they could find. The marshal and several deputies had established a command position behind the blacksmith shop, and it was toward this that Wyatt and Penelope made their way. As they approached, a deputy spotted them and raised his rifle. "Halt right there," he ordered. Wyatt raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "We're not with Kane. We're the witnesses he's been hunting. Miss Frost here can identify him for the marshal." The deputy hesitated, then called over his shoulder, "Marshal, got 2 civilians here say they're the witnesses Kane's after." A tall, broad-shouldered man with a silver star on his chest approached, his experienced eyes quickly assessing them. "I'm Marshal Harkins. You say you can identify Kane?" Penelope stepped forward. "Yes, sir. I saw him and his men rob the bank in Idaho City. They've been hunting us ever since." Marshal Harkins nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "Then you're the ones Edwin telegraphed about. Good. We've been after Kane for months. With your testimony, we can finally put him away for good, assuming he surrenders." "He won't," Wyatt said confidently. "Kane's not the type to be taken alive." "You know him?" the marshal asked sharply. "Know of him," Wyatt clarified. "His reputation precedes him, and I've seen how he operates the past couple days. He's cornered now, and that makes him dangerous." Marshal Harkins seemed to appreciate Wyatt's assessment. "You handle a gun well." "Yes, sir." "Then I could use your help. You know the town layout." Wyatt explained what he had observed during their time in Centerville, pointing out where Kane and his men had positioned themselves. The marshal listened attentively, then incorporated Wyatt's information into his strategy. "Miss Frost, you should stay here where it's safe," Marshal Harkins advised Penelope. She was about to protest when Wyatt caught her eye, his gaze pleading. After all they'd been through, the thought of being separated now, of him walking into danger without her, was almost unbearable. But she understood the practicality of the marshal's order. "Be careful," she said to Wyatt, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Wyatt's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "I will. This will be over soon." With that promise, he joined the marshal and his deputies as they moved to surround Kane's position. Penelope watched him go, offering a silent prayer for his safe return. The standoff continued for another tense hour. Marshal Harkins called for Kane's surrender several times, each offer met with defiant gunfire from the outlaws. Penelope could only watch and wait, her heart in her throat every time shots rang out, terrified that one might find Wyatt. As the sun began to set, painting the town in shades of gold and crimson, the marshal's patience ran out. With careful coordination, his men closed in on Kane's position from multiple angles. The final confrontation was brief but intense, a furious exchange of gunfire that left the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. When it was over, Luther Kane lay dead in the street, along with 2 of his men. The remaining bandits, outnumbered and outgunned, finally surrendered. Penelope scanned the scene desperately, searching for Wyatt among the lawmen gathering in the street. Relief flooded through her when she finally spotted him, alive and apparently unharmed, helping to secure one of the captured outlaws. She ran to him, propriety forgotten in the emotional aftermath of danger. Wyatt saw her coming and opened his arms, catching her as she flew into his embrace. "You're all right," she breathed against his chest, her hands checking him for injuries nonetheless. "I was so worried." Wyatt's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her hair. "It's over now, really over. Kane's dead and his men are in custody. You're safe." Marshal Harkins approached them, tactfully clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Mr. Oakley, Miss Frost. You've been through quite an ordeal, but thanks to your courage and quick thinking, one of the territory's most wanted outlaws is no longer a threat." He tipped his hat to them. "The people of Idaho owe you a debt of gratitude." "We just did what anyone would do," Wyatt replied modestly. The marshal chuckled. "Not anyone. Most folks would have looked the other way or thought only of saving themselves." He grew more serious. "We'll need your formal statements, of course, but that can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I suggest you both get some rest. The hotel's been secured." After the marshal left them, Wyatt turned to Penelope, his hands gently framing her face. "Before all this happened," he said softly, "you were about to tell me something." Penelope smiled, remembering the moment in the cellar before they were interrupted. "I was going to say that I know it's fast, perhaps foolishly so, but I think I'm falling in love with you, Wyatt Oakley." The look that came over Wyatt's face was one of such joy and tenderness that it made Penelope's heart swell. "There's nothing foolish about it," he said, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "Not when I feel the same way." He leaned down, and their lips met in a kiss that held all the emotion of the past days, the fear, the hope, the growing affection that had blossomed into something deeper. Around them, the town of Centerville began to come back to life as people emerged from hiding, but Wyatt and Penelope were lost in their own world, finding in each other's arms the peace they'd been seeking. The following weeks brought significant changes to both their lives. After giving their statements to Marshal Harkins, they returned to Penelope's farm in Idaho City, finding it untouched but in need of attention after her absence. The town welcomed her back with open arms, relieved to hear of Kane's demise, and impressed by the bravery of both Penelope and the hero Cowboy, who had rescued her. Wyatt stayed, helping to repair the barn where their adventure had begun and tending to the farm that had been neglected in Penelope's absence. What had started as temporary assistance soon took on a more permanent feeling as their relationship deepened. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Idaho sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Wyatt took Penelope's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice slightly nervous in a way she rarely heard from him. "About the future, about us." Penelope's heart quickened. "What about us?" Wyatt turned to face her, his blue eyes serious yet warm with affection. "When I came to Idaho, I was looking for work, for a place to belong. I never expected to find someone who would make everywhere feel like home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but my feelings are true. Penelope Frost, will you marry me?" Tears of joy sprang to Penelope's eyes as she looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this good, honorable man who had risked his life for a stranger, who had shown her what real strength and courage looked like, who had awakened feelings in her heart she'd never known were possible. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, Wyatt, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. They were married in the small church in Idaho City 2 weeks later, with the whole town turning out to celebrate. The story of their meeting of the bandits who had Penelope pinned inside the barn and the brave cowboy who climbed the roof to rescue her had become something of a local legend, retold in the saloon and around dinner tables throughout the region. In the years that followed, the Oakley farm prospered under their joint care. Wyatt's experience with cattle led them to expand beyond vegetables and chickens, adding a small herd that grew with each passing season. Penelope's knowledge of the land and its rhythms complemented Wyatt's ranching skills perfectly, and together they built something neither could have achieved alone. Their family grew as well. First came William, a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed Elizabeth, whose curly hair and infectious laugh brightened even the darkest days. And finally, little Samuel, named for Wyatt's father, completed their family circle. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Wyatt surprised Penelope with a gift, a small carved wooden barn with a tiny figure climbing its roof. She laughed through tears as she held it, remembering the fear of that day, but also the hope that had been born in the midst of danger. "Do you ever wonder," she asked as they sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard, "what would have happened if you hadn't come along that day? If you had taken a different trail or arrived a few minutes later?" Wyatt considered this, his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "I don't believe it was chance," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, Penelope. Some people are meant to find each other, no matter what stands in their way." She leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that he was right. Through bandits and bullets, through fear and flight, they had found each other. And in doing so, they had found home.